Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and I kind of thought I was done with the content for the day. If I'm honest, I was sitting on the couch. I was hanging out with Em, my fiance, for those of you who don't know, and we're watching The Office, and then this pops up on my phone. And apparently, John Wall is now a member of the Houston Rockets, and Russell Westbrook is a member of the Washington Wizards, because the NBA just doesn't allow you to ever take a break. I'm excited. It's a really cool, it's an interesting trade, and that's what we're going to be taking a look at in today's video. But quickly before we get started, if you enjoy content like this, including emergency videos like this, then be sure to subscribe. I upload twice a day, every day. Normally, this is my third video of the day, though, because crazy things just happen to happen. It's a great place for consistent NBA content, if that's the thing that you're into. You can also leave a like rating on the video as well. Helps me out a ton. Lets me know you're enjoying this particular piece of content and gets it out to more people on YouTube as well. And you can hang out with me at various socials at the bottom of the screen. And with those things said, let's talk about Russell Westbrook to the Washington Wizards in exchange for John Wall and a first-round pick. There are a lot of things to talk about here. We'll first talk about the trade, and then we'll talk about potential ramifications of the trade, most specifically as they relate to Houston. So, this is something that I think I've talked about in like maybe 3 different videos, right? Whether it's talking about the Houston situation or in a video that I made about trades that almost happened. I talked about how, a lot of people around the league kind of thought this was going to happen last week. That John Wall, as someone that hasn't played in so long and kind of got wind of the idea that the team was shopping him a little bit, just ultimately decided he didn't want to be there anymore. And getting a trade request from someone like John Wall puts Washington in a really difficult situation. And that had been reported, by Shams and Woj that Wall had requested a trade. And then a lot of people thought that this specific deal was going to go down at some point last week, where it's Wall and a first-round pick in exchange for Westbrook. And for Washington, again, that puts them in a difficult position, because coming into the season, it seemed like they were hoping to see what they had in Wall and Beal and then go from there in a potential John Wall or Bradley Beal trade. But if Wall didn't want to be there anymore, that obviously complicated matters. And meanwhile, for Houston, Russell Westbrook also requested a trade. So both of these guys get their wish in terms of being moved to a different team. And Westbrook, it seemed like, just kind of wanted to be in a different situation other than Houston. He wanted to go somewhere else. He wanted to be somewhere where ideally he could be kind of the main guy. And it doesn't really appear as though he's getting that here in Washington. So for Wall now in Houston, the first round pick, which is a 2023 protected first round pick that's going to Houston, it's kind of difficult to speculate on what the John Wall as a Houston Rocket thing is going to look like, because we don't know if this now means that Houston is willing to move on from their other players, most notably, of course, James Harden. It had always been kind of assumed that once Westbrook got traded, Harden would probably follow suit, and I would assume that would still be the case unless the idea of playing with John Wall is really exciting James Harden, which I can't imagine would be the case. So I think this is the most significant piece of information that we've gotten to this point, that a James Harden trade could actually happen within the next couple of weeks. And if that is the case, then Houston is basically having John Wall on their roster as like a showcase player. Like, they want to make John Wall look as good as they can. They want to build their offense around him, have him put up good numbers so that they could potentially flip him for other pieces down the road. At least that would be what I would imagine would be the case. Unless they're getting like veteran pieces in exchange for Harden and they're building this team around John Wall, who hasn't played in 2 years, it would seem like they would get young pieces for Harden, add to these first round picks that they added to the roster, whether it be in the Covington trade or in obviously this trade, getting a first round pick from Washington. And then, a year from now, you trade Wall. He'll be on a 1-and-1 deal at that point. He's got a $40+ million deal for next season, and then a player option for the following, which he would, of course, accept. And then Westbrook is on a similar deal as well for Washington. They're the number 3 and number 4 highest paid players in the league for this upcoming season, by the way. And it seems like that would be the reason why you would make this deal, is Westbrook doesn't want to be there. Wall doesn't want to be in Washington. You get the extra first. You take the risk on Wall potentially being a bit of a disaster, quite honestly, because he hasn't played in so long and his contract is so big. Worst case, assuming there's a Harden trade in the works here, worst case, he gets his money and then he moves on after his player option is over, and you at least get your extra first round pick. Best case, John Wall actually looks like 90% of his former self, looks like a good trade asset. Next offseason, he's a much more movable piece as a 1-and-1 player rather than a player that's currently on a 3-year contract. And then you get extra pieces. You've already traded Harden. You start to rebuild your team that way. So that kind of has to be the mindset right here if you're Houston. Meanwhile, for Washington, you're getting a player back in Russell Westbrook that is just more of a sure thing. And you can talk, if you want to, about the Russell Westbrook that we saw this season in comparison to the John Wall that we saw as a third-team All-NBA caliber guy before, a bad season and then before getting hurt. You can talk about the comparison between those two players, but objectively, current Russell Westbrook, rather than John Wall coming off of not having played in 2 years, is just a better player and a better asset for this group. Now, giving up the extra first-round pick is obviously the penalty and the price that you pay to get more of a sure thing in Russell Westbrook. As of right now, I'm unsure of the protections, but generally on 2023, picks that far in the future, I would imagine this is a top 10, maybe a lottery protected pick. And this is basically a contract swap with a little bit of benefit to Houston because they're getting a player that not only wants to be there, presumably in Wall, and they could potentially rehab into an asset rather than someone like Russell Westbrook that just doesn't want to be there. But then they're also getting the first round pick as well to kind of help them move and shake this roster around. Now, for both of these teams moving forward, I think this is most interesting for Washington because there's been a lot of maneuvering in the Eastern Conference this offseason among teams, including Washington, that are trying to push for that last playoff spot in the Eastern Conference, whether it be Atlanta making big moves in free agency, whether it be Charlotte bringing in Gordon Hayward, whether it be Chicago making the coaching change and bringing in the 4th overall pick and Patrick Williams and potential shakeups to that roster. And now the Wizards adding adding Russell Westbrook in place of a player in John Wall that arguably could have been a zero for this team potentially this season if he got injured or just simply wasn't good. I think this is actually a pretty significant win for Washington, considering how difficult it would have been to get out from under that John Wall contract in any other circumstance. And assuming that Westbrook is healthy, he's going to be one of the better guards in the Eastern Conference. And that's all Washington is hoping for here, is being a playoff team and keeping Bradley Beal happy and engaged there in Washington. And it's interesting because it seemed like Westbrook's idea in terms of moving teams would have been to be, the lead guy in a team. And now he's going to another team that has another, high volume scoring guard, just like James Harden. Beal's not on the same level in terms of volume that Harden is, but it's still kind of an interesting comparison between the two situations. But regardless, if those two guys are good and they're healthy, and then Bertans is making shots, you've got Rui Hachimura, you've got Thomas Bryant, I think you can make the case that that's got to be a playoff team in the East, which is a blow to teams like Atlanta, to teams like Chicago, to teams like Charlotte that are pushing for that 8th seed in the Eastern Conference. I think that this would, again, assuming everyone's healthy, which recently with Westbrook has not been a guarantee, would make them a playoff team in the Eastern Conference, which means for me, I kind of love the deal. And I'm not the biggest Russell Westbrook guy. And that fit between those two players, him and, Beal, is just as questionable as Wall and Beal. But when you're going for more of a sure thing and you're really trying to make your team at least, decent and relevant again this season, I like it, especially if we're looking at a pick that is top 10 or lottery protected in 2023. For Houston, I think it's a move that you kind of have to make at a certain point, given the fact that Westbrook doesn't want to be there. And then we'll kind of see what they do with James Harden moving forward. I think that's the bigger takeaway for them. But the bigger takeaway for me for Washington is that I think this makes them straight up a better team for next season. The thing that would concern me, though, if I was a Wizards fan, is not only giving up the pick, but also the fact that in general, Westbrook is not a guy that players love to play for, right? And I'm not blaming, KD leaving entirely on Westbrook, and him wanting to leave Houston is probably more of an individual decision than it was a Harden doesn't want to play with him situation. But if you're looking at a potential downside here, it is that there's no guarantee that Russell Westbrook's presence in Washington is going to necessarily be beneficial to their attempt to retain Bradley Beal in potential free agency in years moving forward, or just to retain him in terms of him not requesting a trade. I think that's something that has to be considered, is how the play style of Westbrook potentially could upset Bradley Beal. Now, if they're winning basketball games and they're back in contention for a playoff spot, maybe that's enough for Bradley Beal, and then you just have a really good backcourt, potentially one of the better backcourts in the Eastern Conference when healthy. But I do think that is something to be considered. But regardless, this is one of those classic, later in the offseason, out of nowhere deals that the NBA just have, and they have it over every other sport, and it's why it's the best. It's the best league in the States for content, and it's not particularly close. It's a super cool deal. It's really interesting to see how it's going to affect both teams moving forward, and maybe, just maybe, there's a James Harden trade in the works here for Houston as well, which would be really, really fun and something that I would certainly look forward to. But that is going to be the end of today's emergency video. I thank you all very much for watching. I know that I try and get these out as quickly as I can, so if I'm a little bit, lighter on like the details of the exact protections of the pick, I apologize, but you guys of course understand that, and I know you'd rather just kind of hear what I have to say rather than going into super specifics about the protections on the pick. If there's anything else about this deal that intrigues me moving forward, or there's more details that come out, you might see a video on this tomorrow as well. But for now, that is going to be my entire thought on the Russell Westbrook, John Wall, and first round pick trade that went down a handful of minutes ago. But yeah, that's going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.